So you want to invade Finland? Excellent choice. Of every country on your list, this is the only one where your exact experiment has already been run, full scale, by a superpower, at odds of nearly 50 to 1. The results were so catastrophic that they are still taught in every war college on Earth, and they quietly helped set the course of the Second World War. So today's audit works differently. First, we check your plan against the historical receipt. Then, we check it against the Finland that exists right now. And at the end, I will read you the itemized bill. Stay for the final line item. It did not exist in 1939. It was added in April of 2023, and on its own, it turns your quick Northern War into the last decision your government ever makes. Let us start with your staff briefing, because on paper, this looks like the softest target in Europe. Finland has around 5.5 million people. There are no Alps here, no granite fortress like our Swiss case. The land is low and flat and quiet. The border you would cross runs about 830 miles, far too long for a small army to man, which means you can pick your crossing points at leisure. And your analysts will note a precedent that Switzerland could not offer. Someone already invaded Finland, and that someone walked away with 11% of the country. So it is winnable. Your briefing ends with a familiar phrase: a short, sharp operation. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Here is the problem. Every bullet point in your briefing also appeared in the Soviet briefing of November 1939. Moscow also planned for about 2 weeks. The stories say some Red Army units packed parade uniforms and marching band instruments for the victory celebration in Helsinki. What they got instead was 105 days that humiliated the largest army on the planet in front of the entire world. So before we talk about your tanks, we need to talk about what this country does to tanks. Start with the ground, because the ground has a strategy of its own. Finland is the most forested country in Europe. Roughly 3/4 of it is trees, packed dense, cut by around 188,000 lakes and endless bogs that swallow anything heavier than a man on skis. This is not terrain that blocks an army the way mountains do. It is worse. It admits the army, and then it digests it. Off the roads, your vehicles sink and your formations dissolve. So you will stay on the roads, and here is the catch. In the border country, there are barely any. Your entire invasion compresses onto a handful of narrow forest tracks, single file, engines idling, a steel queue stretching for miles between walls of pine. Now add the calendar. Finnish winter runs to -30 and -40. The temperature where Celsius and Fahrenheit agree. And if you have seen our case file on mud, ice, and dust, you already know what that number does to engine blocks, gun grease, and men. And in December, the sun barely reports for work, a few pale hours in the south. In Lapland, it does not rise at all. Your 2-week operation will be conducted in the dark, at 40 below, on 1-lane roads through a forest that is watching you. And we know exactly what that looks like, because on November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union ran the test. 4 days earlier, Soviet artillery had shelled a Soviet border village called Mainila, and Moscow blamed Finland. The pretext was manufactured in-house. Then, around 500,000 men crossed the border in the opening wave, backed by thousands of tanks and thousands of aircraft, against a nation of fewer than 4 million people whose army owned 32 tanks. Moscow was so confident that 1 day into the war, it unveiled Finland's next government, a puppet cabinet announced in the border village of Terioki. That government would never rule anything beyond the village it was announced in. To be fair to the men in those columns, the Red Army of 1939 had a hidden wound. Stalin's purges had just executed or imprisoned a huge share of its own officer corps. The army was enormous, and it was walking into the forest half blind. What waited in the forest were ghosts. The Finns fought in white, on skis, in small, silent groups that materialized out of the tree line, struck, and vanished. The Soviet columns wore olive drab against the snow, which meant the Finns could see everything and the Soviets could see nothing but white. The Finnish method even had a name from the woodpile: motti, a stack of firewood. Let the column push deep along its single road, then chop it into segments the way you cut a log, surround each piece, and let the cold do the heavy lifting. And the Finns added one signature touch of arithmetic cruelty. They shot up the field kitchens first. No hot food at 40 below is not a discomfort, it is a countdown. The masterpiece was at Suomussalmi, on a forest track called the Raate Road. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division, a full mechanized division with tanks, trucks, and artillery, pushed down that single road and froze into 120-mile queue that could not leave the pavement because the snow beside it was waist deep. Finnish ski troops cut it into pockets and collapsed it in about a week. When it was over, the Finns had captured 43 tanks, dozens of guns, and hundreds of vehicles, many abandoned with engines that froze while idling. Thousands of Soviet soldiers died on that one road. Finnish losses were counted in the hundreds. And when the tanks did reach Finnish lines, the defenders greeted them with a weapon mass-produced by the National Liquor Company, a bottle of thickened gasoline named in honor of the Soviet foreign minister. The Molotov cocktail was Finland's review of Molotov's claim that Soviet planes were dropping bread. We audited that weapon in another case file. The short version is that it cost pocket change and it burned tanks by the hundreds. But if the motti was the method, one man became the message. In the snow above Lake Ladoga, there was a farmer named Simo Häyhä, 5'3", quiet, unremarkable, and in about 100 days of war, Finnish records credit him with over 500 kills. The Red Army called him the White Death. His technique was pure Finnish arithmetic. He refused a telescopic sight because a scope forces your head higher and its lens can flash in the light. So he killed at range with plain iron sights. He packed the snow in front of his position so the muzzle blast would not kick up powder and betray him. He kept snow in his mouth so his breath would not steam. The Soviets answered him with counter-snipers and artillery strikes. On March 6, 1940, an explosive bullet tore through his jaw, and the men who carried him back said half his face was gone. He lived. He woke from his coma around the very day the war ended, and he went on to live another 60 years, farming and hunting. One man, a rifle, and cold patience, and he subtracted a battalion's worth of soldiers from a superpower. Your invasion plan now has to price in an entire culture of him. Now, your analysts will interrupt here because they know how this ends. In February of 1940, the Soviets finally did the unglamorous thing that works. Marshal Timoshenko massed fresh armies and wall-to-wall artillery on the Karelian Isthmus, the one stretch of front where terrain allowed a sledgehammer, and hammered the Finnish line at Suma until it cracked. Finland's famous Mannerheim Line, by the way, was never the concrete monster Soviet propaganda described. The propaganda inflated it to excuse 3 months of humiliation. It was a modest line held by winter, terrain, and stubbornness. And by March, even stubbornness was running out of men. On March 13, 1940, Finland signed. It ceded about 11% of its territory, including Viipuri and the Karelian lands. Over 400,000 Finns packed what they could carry and walked out of the ceded territory rather than live under the invader's flag, and the rest of the country took every one of them in. So yes, technically, the invader gained ground. Now read what it paid. When the Soviet archives finally opened decades later, the official ledger admitted more than 126,000 Soviet dead and missing in 105 days. Independent estimates run toward 170,000. Finland lost about 26,000 men. Call it 5 invaders dead for every defender, plus well over 1,000 tanks and hundreds of aircraft, to annex a strip of frozen forest from a country of 4 million. A Finnish soldier is supposed to have joked that there were so many Russians and Finland was so small, where would they find room to bury them all? The Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations before Christmas. Khrushchev later wrote that even the victory felt like a defeat, and the most expensive line on the receipt was invisible at the time. Watching from Berlin, Hitler studied the Red Army's performance and reached the conclusion that would kill tens of millions. If tiny Finland could do this, the Soviet colossus must be rotten. The Winter War became an exhibit in the file marked Barbarossa. When the whole war finally ended, only 3 capitals of warring European states had never been occupied: London, Moscow, and Helsinki. There is a 1944 postscript your staff should read, because Moscow demanded a rematch. In between, Finland had gone shopping for allies and found exactly one on offer: Germany. And in 1941, it marched alongside Hitler to take its land back. That alliance is a case for another courtroom. What matters for your audit is the summer of 1944, when the Soviet Union came back with everything, a full-scale offensive by an army that was, by then, beating the Wehrmacht itself. At Tali-Ihantala, the largest battle ever fought in the Nordic countries, the Finns stopped it. Finland left the war bruised, short 11% of its land, paying reparations for years. But it ended the Second World War the way it began it: independent, democratic, and never occupied. 2 rounds against a superpower, 0 occupations. That is the historical baseline your plan is being graded against. Which brings us to the Finland you would actually be invading, because the porcupine did not relax. It went professional. Finland never abolished conscription, never bought the peace dividend, never stopped assuming this exact briefing would land on someone's desk. Today, it can mobilize a wartime strength of around 280,000 troops, drawn from a trained reserve of roughly 900,000 in a nation of 5.5 million. Behind them sits about 1,500 artillery systems, the largest artillery park in Western Europe, which is a strange thing for a small, peaceful country to own, unless you understand who the artillery is for. 64 F-35 stealth fighters are on order, with deliveries beginning, and in the meantime, Finnish pilots practice landing fighter jets on public motorways. Because, like our Swiss defendants, the Finns assume their air bases die on day 1, and the highway network does not. Along the eastern approaches runs the Salpa Line, around 750 miles of bunkers, trenches, and granite dragon's teeth, the largest construction project in Finnish history. It has never been attacked, and historians argue that is precisely the point. Underneath the cities, the state maintains civil defense shelter places for more than 4 out of 5 citizens, and Helsinki alone has carved an underground network with more protected spots than the city has residents, complete with facilities that serve as swimming pools and sports halls until the day they serve as something else, and the people. In survey after survey, roughly 4 out of 5 Finns say they would defend the country even if the outcome looked uncertain, among the highest figures measured anywhere on Earth. There is a Finnish word for the trait, sissu, and it does not translate, but 105 days of 1940 is a decent definition. So let us read your bill. Line 1, the assault force. The last customer needed the better part of 1 million men against a Finland with 1/10 of today's firepower, and paid 5 for 1. Price yours accordingly. Line 2, the Q-tax. Every axis of your advance is a forest road with pre-registered artillery coordinates, and Finland owns more tubes than anyone in Western Europe. Line 3, the occupation. At the standard 20 to 25 soldiers per 1,000 inhabitants. Holding 5.5 million Finns costs you roughly 130,000 troops, garrisoned indefinitely in the most forested country in Europe, among 900,000 trained reservists and a civilian population that hunts as a hobby and shelters underground as a birthright. Line 4, the calendar. Every winter, the thermometer joins the resistance for free. Line 5, reputation. The last invasion of Finland got its perpetrator expelled from the community of nations and taught the world its army was weaker than advertised. And that lesson metastasized into the deadliest war in human history. And now the final line item, the one I promised you. On April 4th, 2023, Finland joined NATO, roughly doubling the alliance's land border with Russia overnight. Which means the 830 miles of quiet forest border in your briefing is now the tripwire of Article 5. The moment your first soldier crosses it, you are not at war with 5.5 million Finns. You are at war with 32 nations, including 3 that own nuclear weapons. In 1939, Finland's tragedy was that it stood completely alone. It fixed that. The verdict of this court: invasion of Finland denied. Not because it cannot be reached, because it has already been tried at 50-1 odds by an empire with unlimited manpower and no free press to answer to. And the price was 126,000 dead at minimum, a global humiliation, and a receipt so instructive that the defenders spent the next 80 years upgrading every item on it. The forest is still there, the winter is still there, the reservists are still there, and now the alliance is there too. Case number 2, closed. Your list has a third country on it, and this one your staff finds genuinely funny. No fortified border because it has no land border at all. A defending army smaller than a single one of your field armies. The catch is that it sits at the end of the longest supply line on the planet. Everything on it is trying to kill you before the defenders even wake up. And the last empire that seriously planned this invasion was defeated by the map before the fleet ever sailed. That case file opens next. If you want your invasion plans rejected properly, hit subscribe, because the Iron Verdict Court is now in session.